Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Amy Matthews. Amy has been teaching movement since the early 1990s. She is a body-mind centering teacher, a certified Laban movement analyst, an infant developmental movement educator, and a movement therapist and yoga teacher based in New York City. Amy has partnered with Sarah Barnaby to create Babies Project, a space in New York City where we are today, dedicated to developmental movement for babies of all ages. Previously, she was a director of the Breathing Project and co-authored with Leslie Kaminoff the best-selling book Yoga Anatomy. Amy is a program director for the School for Body-Mind Centering and teaches on SME and IDME programs in the US, Germany, and Italy. She taught for 4 years with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen in Berkeley, California, and was on the faculty of the Laban Bertenieff Institute of Movement Studies for 10 years. Amy has participated several times in Gil Hedley's dissection workshops and has studied kinesthetic anatomy with Irene Dowd and BMC with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. She has studied and practiced yoga for more than 20 years, as well as dance, full contact karate, which I did not know, and Aikido. Amy teaches embodied anatomy and movement workshops for programs in the US and internationally, and works privately integrating Laban movement analysis, Bertenieff fundamentals, yoga, body-mind centering, and proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. So hi, Amy. Thanks so much for joining me.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start my conversation with you today with sort of where we're at, which I mentioned in the bio is we're at the Babies Project. This is sort of your current baby creatively. So let's talk a little bit about the Babies Project. You know, what is the inspiration about it? What is the work that you're doing here? And why is it important?
So a part of my training is as an IDME, which is an infant developmental movement educator. And that body of work comes out of body-mind centering, which is a somatic practice that I teach. And what it is about working directly with the infants and with the infants' caregivers about how they're touched and handled, mainly, so that their experiences of the world and of movement are, as early as possible, facilitating their learning. And one of the basic IDME ideas is that babies come in, we come in as babies, curious, and ready to learn, that we don't need to be taught. We just need to be in an environment where things don't get in the way of us learning. But because we're handled, we're picked up, we're set down, it doesn't mean as caregivers that we just leave them alone all the time. It means that the way we hold them, we pick them up, we put them down, we hand them off, the way we talk to them, all of those things shape their environment, and they end up having an effect on their experience of the world. Right. So we're not completely hands-off, but we're not teaching them how to do movements. We're being with them, being a witness, or being in relationship to them while they do things.
So is there a sense in which, you know, as we evolve as babies in our initial years, there are these sort of forces that are informing our way of moving in the world that are relatively unconscious? And so in this environment of the Babies Project, there's more of a conscious understanding of the conditions that are fruitful for optimal movement, or is it, because I guess my question is sort of grounded in this idea that when I first heard about the Babies Project, that, and I know this isn't what you're doing, but this idea that I feel like a lot of people in our times feel, which is that there needs to be, you know, we need to be hyper aware of all of the kind of conditions or things affecting the babies in an almost rigid way, almost as if it's like another form of discipline. Babies can't be in dangerous areas, babies can't fall, all these sorts of things.
Yeah. No, we're not doing that.
Okay, great.
What we're looking at is that babies, how to say it, that human babies don't grow up as feral creatures figuring everything out. So they can't learn without an environment and a culture to learn in.
Yeah.
They also, however, are not blank slates who need to be fed every little bit of everything.
Right.
So we want to help the idea happen that if we're with them in a in a pretty simple environment, like gravity is a huge force. And then there's already a ton of stimulus, certainly in New York City.
Yeah. And
the stimulus of relationships or of color or light or sound, that maybe it's about finding the sweet spot between offering them enough that they're curious. Well, first of all, we want to start from, do they feel safe? Do they feel comfortable? Do they feel bonded to us?
Yeah.
And then can they get curious?
Yeah.
And then if we can do those things to establish safety and comfort and a sense of relationship, then they'll get curious. So it's not about being like a helicopter parent. It's not about keeping them from doing things. We're really into teaching them how to fall and teaching parents how to help them learn how to fall. We're very into not putting them into positions they can't get themselves into and out of, so that they learn how to do those transitions themselves. And when they can't do it, that they don't, when they're not ready to do something, they don't do something. But then when they are, they have the curiosity to do it. So can they be adventurous without being reckless?
Yeah.
Can they be confident but not overconfident, but also not afraid? And that's some kind of sweet spot between doing nothing and doing everything.
Yeah, yeah. This sort of reminds me a little bit of, I heard about this designer. I mean, you never think about the person who designs jungle gyms for children, but there's maybe this woman who designed jungle gyms for children, and the whole ethos is really that, we went through this period where they were trying to make everything hyper safe, and so there was no possibility that a child could hurt themselves. And her whole theory is that no, actually there needs to be the opportunity to fall and hurt yourself, because that's part of the kind of evolutionary process. So you're nodding your head, so I'm assuming you agree with that.
Yes, we completely agree. You're like the fourth person to tell me about this woman, and I was given the book for my birthday, which I haven't read yet, but that's exactly the idea. And also, I think that it's this person that's like, let's not make the playground look like a castle.
Right.
Let's just make it look like a playground, and then they'll make it look like things. I mean, they'll make it into whatever they imagine. Like, we have a toddler's class, and the number one toy in our toddler's class is the salad spinner and the plastic bin. And they put things in it, they take things out, they don't need
much.
They don't need a story, and they just love to do things. And they love to do things that adults are doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So in your bio it says babies of all ages. Now I read that as like we're all babies. But then later I was thinking, well, maybe it just means, toddlers and infants to toddlers and something like that. So what does it mean?
Well, it does mean both. The infant developmental education work, the IDME work, is for infants from newborns to walking, very specifically. We've spread it up into toddlers now because we want to see how these principles carry out, and there's kind of a gap between the infant work and then when they go to preschool. So we're trying to fill in that gap for people in the area. But also, a part of the body-mind centering work is about developmental movement with adults. And these questions, are you safe? Do you know you will survive? Are you comfortable? Do you know how to get comfortable? If you're not comfortable, can you get comfortable? If you're not getting comfortable, and you could be getting comfortable, why aren't you getting comfortable? Do you have, are you bonded? Do you feel the support of the floor? Do you feel the support of the other people? Are you able to learn new information? Are you curious? These are questions for teaching adults, too. Like these, as a teaching question, those run through all of my teaching. Because if any student doesn't feel safe, then it's really hard to do anything but like force information in.
Yeah.
And I think that learning for all of us comes out of an experience of curiosity at its best. There is also a kind of learning that comes out of problem solving, like this really sucks, I need to fix it. But we're talking about a different kind of curiosity that's about like, wow, I wonder what would happen if I put my head on my knee. Can I be curious about myself in that moment? So that's the idea, and that if we missed a developmental window as infants, because there's all this literature about like this is the window of time when an infant learns to do something, and if you miss the window closes. We don't believe that. Like
right.
If you said to me, well, I never crawled, I miss learning how to do this, I'd be like, all right, Jacob, let's figure out how to like make those connections in your body now, because we continue to be like malleable, and we continue to be curious, and there's always that possibility for change. We don't stop changing when we turn 5 years old.
Right.
So
Which
it
is sort of
also-
against the kind of Freudian idea where there's sort of an imprinting that happens at an early age and you're sort of stuck with that at some point, you know?
Yeah, we don't buy it.
Yeah. So, what are some of the ways in which you see the kind of unconscious cultural forces working on our relationship to movement? Or maybe another way of asking that question is, how are we moving in ways that are very much influenced by our cultural programming, that perhaps in here there's a sense in which we're trying to unprogram those forces? Does that make sense?
It does. I'll say something, then you might have to ask me again.
Okay.
So, one of the things that I see impacting both adults learning movement and infants is the idea that the position is more important than the process. And that in an infant, getting to sitting and being able to sit is the like 6-month milestone, and we need to put babies in sitting so they learn to sit. And we don't believe that's the case. That a baby, what's more important than being able to stay in sitting, because what we often see in an infant who's been put in sitting is they learn how to stay there, but they don't know how to get out of it. And if you think as an adult, if you've ever been like put in a position that you don't know how to get out of, what we tend to do is brace and kind of hold and hang on for dear life, because I don't have anything else to do but survive.
Yeah.
So that's not the question we want them to be in. We want it to be a transition question. So it is about the process and not the position. And I think that ends up being true in adult movement as well. And I'm thinking yoga in particular,
Oh, right.
but all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Which leads to a whole idea that I really don't agree with, that the quality of an asana or a position is in the position.
Right.
Rather than in what I bring to it.
Yeah. 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 So I guess another way, I'll ask the question maybe a slightly different way, which is that what are some of the habits of movement that you see that perhaps are more capable of leading to dis-ease? That, you know, habits of movement that are created by our own cultural relationship with our bodies. Do you have any thoughts on that? On habits of movement or habits of posture that are kind of bred by our social programming?
Yeah. I would say that I don't think of it in terms of habits of movement, though I could get really kind of granular and specific and say there are some teaching instructions I think should just be barred from the language.
Right, yeah.
But in a bigger sense, I don't think it's habits of movement. I think it's habits of thinking and habits of value, right? That we value straightness in a way, or we somehow value right angles, or we value effort, and we value sensation in a way that is leading to injury.
What about symmetry? Is that included in there?
Yeah, that's included in there. And it depends on how you define symmetry then, but yes, also that we value symmetry. I would put that right in there. That you do the same thing on both sides, that the two sides have to match, that in
So you would probably disagree with the kind of, I'm thinking of one particular tradition that is trying to align the poses with the idea of geometry, or like sacred geometry, that there's some kind of geometrical correspondence between the ideal body architecture and, you know, what exists sort of universally in the cosmos. Amy's laughing for those of you who can't see.
Well, it's going to be one of the. I'm laughing at myself because I feel like I constantly try to be like, well, let's shift the question a little bit.
Yeah.
I I believe deeply that there's a kind of harmonic spatial relationship in form and in our bodies and in geometry, and I'm a big fan of the logarithmic spiral.
Yes, yeah.
And that kind of sacred geometry in math. So, and I think that our bodies reflect that kind of harmony because we are expressions of those relationships
Right.
happening in nature, molecules all the way up through atoms, all the way up through, atoms through molecules, all the way up through tissues. But what I don't believe is that a right angle is more harmonic or more better, and that if I get myself into a right angle, something magical is going to happen to me. Because I don't think that's all of the geometry that there is. And
Yeah.
so the geometry that orients around angles rather than circles and spirals and fluids and
Yeah.
process. So it depends on, like, you'd have to
How you define
how
geometry.
you define it and what you do with it.
Yeah, I guess what you're really distinguishing between is the idea of a kind of static geometry and a sort of moving geometry or a fluid geometry. And because when I think oftentimes that sort of notion of a geometry that we are the expressions of is kind of this sort of like, it's like Plato's forms. It's like exists up there transcendentally as a kind of, hexagons and octagons. I don't really know anything about geometry, but that's my idea. So you're sort of drawing attention to, with spirals, something more kind of fluid and circular, which actually brings us to the next thing I kind of wanted to talk about, which is something that you're very interested in at the moment, which is swarming and fractality or fractal systems. So I guess my first question is, what do those terms mean to you? Are they synonymous, or do you sort of understand them kind of differently?
Well, so swarming is an idea that my friend and partner in Babies Project, Sarah Barnaby, and I have worked on together. So this is not my idea alone. This is really
Right.
Sarah and I have both been developing this and exploring it. And one of the things that the idea comes out of is the reading that we've done about what intelligence is, and that there's a kind of intelligence that has been very valued in our modern culture about the individual and what they can know and comprehend and process and do, and it's very individualistic, and it's very neurocentric. It's very nervous system oriented, and it is in a way hierarchical. And there's a long time ago, like 7 or 8 years ago, Sarah and I read an article about how groups of animals, like schools of fish and birds, flocks of birds and swarms of bees, how they communicate with each other and are able to do incredibly complex and sophisticated actions in response to things in the environment that as individuals they would not be able to do. But because of the complexity of their relationships, they can do these amazing survival things.
Yeah.
And when we looked further into that, Sarah found this article about fractal systems and how these sets of rules in the fractal systems, that there are simple rules, there's a kind of iteration to it, that the same thing happens over and over, but it can change. There's the agents are similar, but there's some variety. And that what starts to happen in that is these emergent properties arise, not because I as an individual have sat down and said, I am going to be creative now, but emerging out of the relationships. So it's again about movement and relationship. What emerges out of the relationships is something different than what was before, which is called an emergent property of the system or the swarm. So then one of the books we were reading at the time, or anyway, somehow ran into, is a book by Fritjof Capra called, I'm blanking on it and I should have it, but I'll find it.
It's not the Tao of Physics.
No, he wrote the Tao of Physics, but it's a later one.
Okay.
And it's a network theory about
Yeah.
life.
Okay.
And it's much more recent, and he's worked with some programmers about networks and then I think biologists also. And he's got a definition of life now about life not being about a thing, but about a web of connections between agents, where each agent might go away and be replaced, but the web of connections remains. And that web of connections exists far from equilibrium, at the edge of chaos.
Yeah.
And that is what's going on in our bodies, because our cells are dying all the time. But the relationships between them, this web of connections, is somehow maintained. So a lot of the work I do is looking at embryology, is looking at the physiology of our body, at how communication in the body works. And there's so much communication in the body that happens embryologically before we have a nervous system, and in our bodies now alongside the nervous system, not dependent on the nervous system. So what's called the neurocentric view of our body, that like we're a flesh car that's carrying our all-important brain around, it's just mistaken.
Yeah.
Like, our brain did not grow our body.
Yeah.
Our body, in its complexity, grew itself a brain.
Yeah.
So and then what happens? What happens if we think of ourselves as a swarm of relationships instead of an individual intelligence?
Yeah.
And there's certainly importance to individuality, and I need to sometimes act as an individual with my own sense of agency, but that coexists and is interdependent with that. You and I are part of a swarm of people in New York City, and all of our actions and every little relationship is having an impact. And those coexist and are interdependent. And so can we hold both of those, and can we value both of those and bring some of the value up of that more horizontal web kind of model?
Yeah, it's almost like when you're talking about individuality, it's almost like you could say that the highest or most full expression of your individuality is one that is integrated with its own environment or sense of interconnectedness. Yeah. You know, when you were talking about this idea of swarming and things emerging, it sort of made me think about this idea of zeitgeist, which is sort of a very sort of woo-woo term, but really, you know, if the swarming kind of idea really, I think, grounds it in a certain kind of way, in a way that's more, I don't know, you know, scientific language that allows it to sort of to flesh it out. Because there are times when, you know, you have an idea and then all of a sudden you see like that you think is very original, and then you realize, you know, across the globe someone's had this exact same idea, and there's this sense that, you know, in dimensions other than the ones that we can directly perceive, there's this kind of movement of energy happening. So, you know, I guess my question about this then is, conceptually I grasp it, and it sort of, you know, it lights up a whole bunch of things intellectually about and also explains a lot of different kinds of behavior. But in what way does it inform, you know, your teaching, and also how does it inform, you know, what we should do, or how we should approach, or how we should perceive our embodiment?
I'm going to start with the embodiment question.
Yeah.
Part of the question. I think that one of the impacts that this idea of swarming has when I offer it to people in teaching is the idea that there is a level of communication and intelligence or consciousness going on in your body that is not something you have to control with your so-called mind. And then we have to kind of define mind, and we have to define consciousness, and we have to define intelligence, and all of those things, which I would like to redefine all of those.
Yeah.
But if we say that, if I say to you or offer the idea that your body, the cells in your body are talking to each other, and they're responding to things in your environment, they're responding to what you ate, they're responding to your thoughts, they're responding to your position, they're responding to what I'm saying. Some of those responses are coming in through your nervous system to your brain and being processed by your brain. Some of those responses are never going to make it to your nervous system, and your body's just handling it. Now, eventually, a lot of things get to your nervous system because it's kind of a central gathering place for information. But it's not the boss of everything.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times embodiment gets tied together with an idea about mindfulness or consciousness, or that it's something I have to do and that I have to think about. And I would propose that it is what you are. And when I started working with babies and talking about infants a lot, people would say, well, are babies embodied? And they haven't done 6 years of embodiment training, and they don't meditate, and they don't, like, how could they be embodied? And I'm like, well, of course babies are embodied. Like,
Babies don't meditate? Jeez.
Yeah.
Get it together, babies.
Come on, babies. So if I believe that babies are embodied, which there's certainly a school of thought that babies don't even have consciousness until they're able to do this or this or this or this. But
Right.
I don't buy that. I think babies come in with consciousness. They don't come in with communication skills to tell us about their thoughts. They don't, but, so we could argue that premise as well. But if we believe that babies are embodied, then that is what we are. And I think that we learn ideas, and we're back to ideas. We learn things, we learn values that get in the way of our experience of ourselves as embodied creatures. And one of my kind of questions about the embodiment culture is the idea that it is something I have to go get somewhere else and bring back, rather than something I have. I don't even have, I am. And it doesn't mean it's easy to remove the obstacles, but that my practice is about removing the obstacles to what I already am. And some of those obstacles are really concrete physical things, or like movement patterns I've taken on to try to survive what the world's offered me, or strategies I've learned, or addictions, or toxic things I've taken in to try to survive. And so it's not to say it's nothing to find or have an embodiment practice, but it's not something that's not already there.
Right. I see. I understand what you mean by that in sort of the broader sense of, it's already within us, and especially given what I know about you as being kind of opposed to hierarchical models, or at least wanting to, forge non-hierarchical ones alongside the hierarchical ones. But, one of the things I appreciated about when I was listening to one of your interviews before is the way in which, when you first started teaching, you felt limited by or constrained by your own language when it comes to movement. So, talking about this idea of going outside to get something, isn't there a certain sense in which, the language that we are surrounded by, socialized by, and maybe even entrenched in, is limiting our own notion of the possibility of embodied expression in such a way that it would make sense to kind of go find other language to allow me to feel my body more fully. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that to respond to that goes back to then what you asked about, what I think it has to do with teaching.
Yeah.
And I think that, so then, what do I think? I think that my job as a teacher is not to give you embodiment, but to offer you experiences that you might not have by yourself, that might open you, reveal to you your existing embodiment. So I firmly believe that there are things that I can't do by myself, and I need someone else to help me do them. But it doesn't mean it's because I'm lacking. It's because it means the veil over my awareness of something, like I need someone else to help me get through that.
Yeah.
And it's that thing about, like, I know what I know what I don't know. I don't know some of the things I do know. And then there's a whole bunch
You
of
don't know some of the things you do know?
Yeah.
Oh, your body.
Sometimes when I'm
Yes, I
teaching,
knew
something
what you
comes
mean.
out of my mouth, and I'm like, oh, I forgot that I knew that.
It's like you're channeling.
So there's
from the
things
swarm.
Exactly. Exactly. So I know them somewhere, but I don't know I know them.
Yeah.
And then there's a bunch of things that I don't even know I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I didn't come up with this. Donald Rumsfeld, I think I heard say it
Yeah,
first.
I've heard this before too, yeah.
But that set of things that I don't know, that's where someone else could come in and say, did you know that you always start your sentences with, or that you always sit this way, or you always tilt your head this way, or whenever you're angry, the first thing I see you do is this? Like, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, probably somewhere in me, I'm aware that I'm doing it because I'm doing it, but what does it take? And I think that as a teacher, what I can offer people is an outside eye.
Mm-hmm.
And I can offer my subject matter expertise, which is theoretically about anatomy. Like, it's about anatomy in an abstracted way, right? And it's about physiology in theory, and it's about developmental movement as we understand it. But I don't know anything about you.
Mm-hmm.
So what I can bring is like, here's what we understand about physiology and how the endocrine system works. So let me tell you how we would describe that, and then you tell me what your experience is. And if I say something to you and you go, oh my God, I have a whole new understanding of my blood now, then something opened up for you. Mm-hmm. And if I tell you all that and you're like, yeah, so, then I'm like, you don't need to know about your endocrine system as I understand it. We need to talk about something else. So I feel like there's an idea that teachers have to know things to give that knowledge to their students. And it's a problematic model about what education is.
Yeah.
And information can be super useful if it helps you reframe something or see it in a different light. But the information does not hold the embodiment.
Yeah.
The information, like, if it opens a door, great. And if it doesn't open a door, it's just like clutter in your mind.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of hammer this idea down, if that's an expression. The idea of teaching that is sort of a kind of dogmatic, putting of knowledge into you, rather than sharing certain kinds of knowledge that may be of use to you in embodying or in living in your body in a more full way. Is that kind of the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so so now I kind of want to talk about shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about your work on anatomy. And I feel like we're talking a little bit about this already, but one of the keys to this fractality in swarming, and the way that I understand it, is this kind of non-hierarchical. There's no kind of queen bee. Well, there is a queen bee actually, but that's not key to the notion of swarming. So we'll leave that out. So how does the notion of hierarchy play into your understanding of like yoga and movement as it's being taught or as it's being expressed right now in the yoga world, whatever that means? Like, do you see any kind of key issues that relate to a hierarchical model that we could kind of touch upon in terms of the yoga community?
I feel like I see a couple of different things happening in the yoga community, and there's certainly a conversation that people are in about how can I use yoga to explore my experience of myself, and a lot of little threads of teachers and people going out and saying, like, how can you adapt this for yourself, and how can you make it work for yourself? And I love hearing those conversations happen. I feel like there's also a kind of conversation happening about there is a right way to do the pose, and if you do the pose just this way, something magical will happen. And that there's a right muscle to use. Like, Yeah, if we head into the anatomy of it, that then anatomically or physiologically, something will happen when your knee is at a right angle, which then will have a psycho-emotional resonance that will take you down the road to enlightenment or despair or whatever. And
Chaturanga to despair.
and I am a fan of form. I think that form is really interesting as a container for exploration. So I'm very, very interested in whatever thing I'm practicing at the time, in how do I do that version of it. So if I go to an Iyengar class, how can I do an Iyengar Trikonasana, which is really different than Ashtanga Trikonasana. They have different rules. Or the whole thing about your front leg has to be at 90 degrees in a warrior pose. There is nothing better for the knee about having your knee at 90 degrees. You can mess up your knee at 90 degrees, and you can keep your knee safe at 95 degrees. The safety of your knee is not dependent on the 90 degrees. I want to say this so many different places. But it is an interesting question to say, can I do 90 degrees safely? And if that's the form and you say, can you do this? I'll be like, can I do it? And if I can't do it, can I learn to do it? Not because 90 degrees is magical, but because I can't do it. And what I do in learning to do it and stay organized doing it, for example, the process of learning will teach me something about myself. And in the process of learning, do I get frustrated? Do I push too hard? Do I ignore the twinge and just do it? Do I back off because I'm afraid of the effort? Like, that's where the yoga is. There's no yoga in 90 degrees versus 89 or 75. Like, it doesn't matter. But there's also a question, like, if I think I'm doing something and I'm not doing it, do I know that I'm not doing it? And if I know I'm not doing it and I don't care because I don't want to do 90 degrees because I can't do it without hurting myself, then don't do it. But also then don't go to a class where the rule is 90 degrees because that's their form. And there is something about inhabiting a form and respecting what the form is that I think is important.
But it has nothing to do with being more or less safe necessarily.
No. And like, a lot of people hurt themselves doing headstand.
Yeah.
Totally. A lot of people hurt themselves doing lotus. Definitely. It's not the pose's fault.
Yeah.
Lotus does not have to hurt you. There are people who can do lotus totally safely. There are people who can do
from cradle to grave.
From cradle to grave, exactly. They can do headstand. But if we don't know ourselves well enough to know what our capabilities are and what our limits are, then we're caught up in the idea of striving for a pose or for effort or for sensation or for any of these things that I put out, like, as coming in from outside rather than my own embodiment and curiosity. And then I'm imposing something on myself. But it's not the form's fault.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like I know the answer to this already, but I ask you, which is, what are your thoughts on, a lot of anatomical cues in a yoga class? Because I know for me, I'm thinking of this one specific class, although there have been many sort of that are more or less to this extreme, where it's obvious that the teacher is sort of geeking out on anatomy at that moment, and they want to share every single, pedantic detail that they know. And it's it feels like a little bit of a show-off moment, maybe to the teachers in the room, but also it just totally disorients me. I mean, and I know about anatomy to a certain degree. I'm not like an anatomy specialist or anything, but it's so disorienting and actually takes me out of my experience for someone to get so detailed about, some obscure muscle in my shoulder.
So there's a saying, the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
That by Alfred Korzybski, who was one of the founding thinkers around semantics. And the map is not the territory, which you might be familiar with, but the idea is that the way we talk about an experience is not the same as having the experience, if we're talking about movement or something. And that the ways we have taken on trying to articulate how we see the world is an expression of our bias and our assumptions and our culture.
Yeah.
It's not what is. So language is not the same as the experience. Language is by its nature shaped by the context of whoever's creating it. And a model then, a map or a model, but a model is then shaped by the people and the culture of the people building it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't make models, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't use language, because language is the best thing I have so far to communicate, besides touch at a certain point. So language is important and it's limited. Anatomy is not reality. Anatomy is a map. Mm-hmm. Anatomy is one way that our Western culture has come up with to understand the body. And it's based on most of our anatomical language got codified in a time that was dominated by a white male perspective and a mechanistic perspective. So people were looking at bodies as machines in a hugely Christian-based, even though it was, trying to move away from religion, it was still very hierarchical. Well, it was a long span of time, so a lot of things were going on. But the language we have for anatomy comes out of a very particular mindset. And it's really useful to talk about bones and muscles.
Yeah.
But the name of your bone is not the same as your experience of your bone.
Right.
And the way that we are learning anatomy is still an expression of that mechanistic model. Mm-hmm. And it ties back into the kind of geometry and the right angles and the, if we comprehend this, we can control it kind of mindset, mm-hmm. which is a controlling mindset, which is like a controlling mindset as opposed to a participating mindset. So participating mindset, I think, is more of this swarming idea that I don't control it, but I'm part of,
yeah,
and engaging in. So I love anatomy. Mm-hmm. I love it. It's a model that makes a lot of sense to me. And when I think about it, it helps me understand my body in a certain way. And my study of bones, my study of muscles, my study of physiology, of the fluid, all this stuff, it helps me, it gives me doorways into my body where I can be with myself in a different way. It doesn't do that for everybody.
Right.
It does not do that for everybody. And the thing that doesn't do that for me is chakras. If you talk to me about chakras, I have a theoretical understanding of them because I've done my teacher trainings and I listen to and I get it. I get it, but they don't light anything up for me. Mm-hmm. Where if I settle in to try to feel my blood circulating, I have this magical experience of what's going on in my body. Now, they're both models. They're both stories we tell to try to comprehend. So I don't think chakras are wrong. I don't think anatomy is right. I'm like, what works for you? And what helps you into your experience of your body?
Yeah.
And your body is not just bones and muscles.
Yeah.
And one of the issues I have with anatomy being so exalted right now is that then people come to me and they say, well, so what muscles make up Mula Bandha? And I'm like, Mula Bandha is so much more than bones and muscles. Mm-hmm. And we could talk about the muscles that might be related, but there's no, I think it's wrong to limit Mula Bandha to a set of muscles.
Just squeeze your anus.
Squeeze your anus, or engage the levator ani, or even if you get more nuanced about the muscles, and I find it problematic because it ends up diminishing the other model by saying it's not valid until I've mapped it to the anatomical one.
Yes.
And the anatomical
so it's almost
model,
colonialist about it.
It's colonialist. The anatomical model is privileged in this way.
Yeah.
That everything else is
provincial,
ethereal, or provincial, or goofy, or energetic, because it's not. And if you give me an anatomical description, then it's real. And I'm like, that's not it. Anatomy is not any more real. than your experience of your third chakra. It's just, I don't. And then we could talk about like, oh, you find your third chakra, I find my small intestine. Let's talk about that and see. And we might be able to meet there, but we don't have to make them match. There's not one that's more right. So I find the idea that yoga teachers need to talk about anatomy deeply problematic because it privileges anatomy too much. And we end up with these teachers who've learned all this random stuff that may or may not help their student have a deeper experience of themselves. And I think that if someone loves anatomy, totally learn it, talk about it, share it, say like, this is what I geek out on. If you don't want to hear about anatomy, maybe don't come to my class.
Yeah.
But go find someone's class who meets you, or come and see how I do it. And, but you can be an amazing teacher and never talk about anatomy. Yoga is not dependent on anatomy. Yoga is a whole body experience, and you can be an incredible yoga teacher and never talk about bones and muscles. And you can be an awful yoga teacher and
talk about it
rattle
all the
off
time.
all
Yeah.
the bones and muscles. But the caveat to all of that is, if you are going to talk about anatomy, you should know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of flawed anatomy being talked about out there.
Oh, yeah.
And my first choice would be like, stop talking about it and help people have a different experience of themselves, because I think anatomy is also potentially distancing. Like you described your own experience. Like, now I'm thinking about where my muscles are in my body instead of being in the movement.
Yeah.
So anatomy can bring you into yourself, or it can distance you from yourself, like any other model.
Yeah.
And I love it, but I wish it weren't the be all and end all.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm glad we got here, because one of the things I wanted to ask you, which came up, or I had thought to ask because of our mutual friend, Dr. Scott Lyons, mentioned that you would go so far as to say, which is essentially what you've just said, that yoga teachers don't need to learn anatomy. So, then, what makes? I guess the next question then is, what are the components that make a good yoga teacher from your perspective?
Curiosity. I think there could be a lot of different things. But my short list would have on it curiosity, a willingness to what? A capacity to observe and not know. So almost the opposite of what we're taught, which is like to look at someone and say, oh, you're like this because your right shoulder is higher. Like, can I look at you and say, actually, your left shoulder is a little higher than your right? Then how do I have a conversation with you about that? So he just switched shoulders, in case you didn't notice. So a capacity to observe, or skill at observing, a willingness to not know, curiosity. If you're going to use a model, some expertise in that model, like if you're going to talk about yoga, know what style of yoga you're talking about. If you're going to talk about anatomy, know about anatomy. If you're going to talk about something, know what you're talking about. But at the same time, recognize that you're not an expert in the people you're working with. I think some ability to stand up in front of people and take the seat of the teacher, but not need to be right.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the word for this quality is, but I think that there's a humanity to saying, I'm the teacher right now, I'm leading, this is how I structure this class. If you don't want to do this, you can leave. If you do want to do this, this is what we're doing. It does not mean I'm right. It means I'm leading in the moment. And this is a thing that it goes back to the swarming idea, which is one of the things we've found when we've tried to work with groups of people around swarming, is that like when a group of any creatures move around a space, different people end up in front. And the people who end up in front end up needing to lead. And then when the swarm shifts, someone else needs to lead. And one of the things when we try to do these experiments with large groups of people, one of the things that gets in the way of the swarming experience happening is the people who are like, well, what are they going to do over there? And what's the whole group going to do? And what about this? And like they're trying to take care of the whole instead of their own little local thing. So they're trying to hold too much. But the other thing that doesn't work is that when like a group of people pivot and someone ends up in the front and it's their time to lead and they don't, and they do all this like, I don't want to be in front, that's a problem too. So we talk about participating as being willing to step up and lead when it's time to lead, and then willing to step back and participate when it's time to participate. And that ability to step in and out of leadership, or in and out of being in the seat of the teacher, or like that's what I think, one of the things I think that a teacher is really important, that's important for a teacher to do.
Yeah.
To stand up and say, you asked me to teach you, I'm going to offer you what I have. Take it or leave it. You don't have to like it. You have to respect the group that's here right now. Like there's some basic things, like be a good person in the moment. But I'm not the most right, and I don't know what will help you. And somehow sitting in that place, which is really about some quality of relatedness, relationship, availability to relate. And I don't mean we have to be best friends, and I don't, as a teacher, have to tell you all of my stuff, and you don't have the right to ask me all my personal details, but there's a contract between teacher and student in this moment that says, I'll lead, and you'll listen, and then we'll see what happens. And then when it's my time to be teachable, I'll be teachable.
Well, what I really love about this idea of leadership in relation to the swarm that you're talking about is that I feel like leadership is often invoked as kind of, it's an innate feature of certain individuals. You know, someone's a born leader, you know, and what you're saying is that, no, it's really about the configuration of the swarm at any given moment that gives rise to the emergent property of an individual being a leader.
Yeah.
Which is a really beautiful and contextualized way of thinking about leadership.
Yeah. And then how do we raise people willing to lead? Willing to lead when it's time to lead, and not leading when they don't need to lead.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, we're getting close to the end of our time, and it's been so interesting. I have tons more things I could ask you. But, you know, I wanted to ask you this question because, you know, you obviously co-authored this book with Leslie Kaminoff, Yoga Anatomy. Now you say we don't need anatomy to be yoga teachers. So my question is sort of like, how has your perspective on anatomy changed, or how do you think about yoga anatomy differently than you did when you co-authored this book, if at all?
Well, when we wrote the book, like it was my job to do the asana part, to do the bones and muscles and the different asana, and doing the book helped crystallize for me my profound resistance to pinning things down.
Yeah.
And I found that they kind of asked, and Leslie asked me on to do the what muscles working in this pose. And I was like, Leslie, I can't do it. I can't do it. I'll give you a list of what might be, but we can't pin it down. And that's what we did. It's lists. It's like a list of ingredients, and I think in the second edition I wrote more about anatomy. I wrote more in the opening chapters, and we changed the asana part to try to make it even clearer that it's a list of ingredients, not a recipe. And I, like, someone wrote a review on Amazon, and they're like, I use it as my how-to book, and I open it up, and I find every month, and I'm like, no,
Don't do that.
Don't do that. Like, so I appreciate it as a book out there for people who are I'm glad to have done it.
Yeah.
Right? And I want it out there as a book for people, if you're interested in anatomy, to say, look, these are all the things that could be going on in a pose. And there's not one muscle that everybody uses in Trikonasana, and there's not one muscle that everybody stretches in.
Or is that supposed to stretch?
Or that's supposed to stretch. And if you don't feel stretch in your hamstrings in down dog, what's wrong with you? Keep going until you feel stretched. Like, it's so flawed. So I would like it to be a kind of subversive book out there saying, like, here's a way, if you're interested in anatomy, to engage with anatomy. But you don't have to. This isn't telling you anything more important than what a book on what the sutras are, or and I wouldn't say the sutras are the most important thing either, but So I'm happy with how the book is, with what the book is. I'm sometimes unhappy with how it's being used.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to have something in writing out there that, like, you can go away and make of it what you will. And I don't have any relationship to the people reading it except for what I've written, and so I can't. I'm a big fan of calibrating things and engaging in the context of something, and how do I meet someone, and so I don't have a chance to meet them. It's just through the words, and I find that challenging, but I also then travel around the world, and people are like, oh, I've read your book, and they feel like they know me, and I enjoy that too. So it's another thing I sit in the middle of, kind of a paradoxical feeling.
Well, I love that. I love that you're open about, about the work that you do in this kind of, really at the edge of chaos sort of way. So this was actually a question that Scott, because I was talking to Scott about some questions I was going to ask you, and I hope he's listening. And so the question is sort of, what is the future of anatomy? From like this sort of basic Western idea to, functional anatomy, which we didn't really talk about sort of specifically, although, indirectly, I suppose, to kind of experiential anatomy, which seems to be more, that idea of experiential anatomy seems to be more aligned with what's happening now with your work. Unless you disagree with that. But what is the future of kind of our relationship to anatomy?
Well, I don't know what the future is. I know what I hope for.
Can you not see into the future, Amy?
I can't see into the future, no.
It's not one of your skills?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm like firmly right here, very horizontal. I'm not very good at looking ahead. What I would wish for is that people take on ownership of their own bodies. And I don't even mean ownership. I mean, like, take on the participation in their own bodies in a way that they use anatomy when it's useful, in a way that if they're going to go to a doctor, they don't get cowed by anatomical language.
Right.
And that if they go to a yoga teacher and the yoga teacher says something that doesn't make sense to them, that they're like, that doesn't make sense in my body. Can you say it a different way? Mm-hmm. And that one of the things I think is happening in yoga teaching is something that's happening overall in education, which is that we are raised to treat outside people as experts on us.
Yeah.
And what I would wish for is that in all education, but I think particularly in yoga, like, I really wish that this could shift in yoga. And I feel like in the somatics field, where I also am, we're in a place where this could shift, that yoga and somatics could shift this way too. Not letting other people be experts on my experience.
Right.
That you can be an expert on your model of the mind, but don't tell me how my mind works.
Yeah.
And I want to get us into that conversation, which is not just about the future of anatomy, but it's about the future of any expertise in any subject matter.
Right.
And we need experts in the models, and the models are really useful, and they're fascinating. It's fascinating to hear how people construct a story about reality. But it's like it should be like reading mythology in a way. Like, oh, people explained lightning this way years ago, and now they explain it this way. And how are they going to? Like, we have no idea what's coming. But can we use those outside subjects to help us, like, be in relationship with our own experience instead of being told about what our experience is?
Mm-hmm. And how does that help us participate in our own well-being? Or because I feel like that also, it hinges upon this idea of like participatory health or well-being, where it's not just like the doctor, tells me what I need, but that I'm actually participating in the process of my own health.
Yeah. Well, part of it is finding doctors who will be in that kind of participatory relationship,
which is rare,
and demanding it.
Yeah.
And saying, you got to explain this to me again. You got to keep saying it until I understand it. And I'm not going to do it until you tell me what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And but I think we should say that to our yoga teachers too.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to do it just because you said so. And
I hope this inspires just people to like stand up in the middle of a group class and be like, can you repeat that in a different way? You're gonna
come to my class and do that.
You can do that, yeah.
But also, yeah, I think that this is happening, and I think hopefully it will keep happening. And it has to do with speaking up, and it has to do with valuing myself, and it has to do with, like, I'm just going to go there, it has to do with voting.
Yeah.
Like, everybody should go and vote. Voting is participating in the swarm. Like, it's such a swarming thing to do. And, like, we need a government. I believe that we need a government. I don't want to destroy the government, but I want to participate in who's governing us.
Yeah.
And I want them to change.
This is a good note to end on. No, but what were you going to say? You were going to finish a thought.
Yeah, I just think making my own movement choices, making my own social choices, making my own political choices, they're all tied together, and they're all interdependent and kind of co-regulating.
Yeah.
And that's what I wish for us, not to be independent, but to be in relationship and supporting each other.
So, Amy, tell us a little bit about what you're doing as our final note. Obviously the Babies Project is a big thing for you, but what else are you doing at the moment, and do you have any workshops or trainings coming up that people can look into? Well,
in New York City, I am always teaching weekend workshops at Babies Project for adults. So there's developmental movement workshops, there's embodied anatomy workshops. I have weekly classes here when I'm in town. We also have at Babies Project, you can come observe the work we do with infants. If you're curious about what we do or learning more about our principles, on Mondays and Fridays, you can come observe those groups. I'm also part of the training programs in body mind centering. So I'm starting a somatic movement educator certification program in Rhode Island in February of 2019. In June of 2019, I co-teach another training program in Oregon at a place called Moving Within. I also travel, like I'm going to Germany next week to teach on a body-mind centering teacher training, and then I'll do a weekend workshop in Milan. So I teach in Italy, I teach in Ireland, I teach a lot of different places. All the information is on my website.
Babiesproject.com.
So the Babies Project website is babiesproject.org.
Okay.
.org, and then my personal website is embodiedasana.com.
Embodiedasana.com. Well, thank you so much, Amy. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.